Good morning, and on behalf of the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, welcome to those of us here in Port of Spain this morning, and also to an audience worldwide. This event is being streamed live, part of the Edinburgh the Edinburgh World Writers Conference program, a partnership between Bocas here in Trinidad, Edinburgh International Book Festival, and the British Council. This is a worldwide conversation which is taking place in a sort of relay across the globe among several different international literature festivals. The last one took place in Turkey, in fact, in Izmir. There are 4 still to come later this year in Melbourne, Kuala Lumpur, Malo, and Lisbon. And alongside that, there is also a global conversation taking place continuously on the internet, on the web. And this is in fact marking a cycle over the year which began at last year's 2012 Edinburgh International Book Festival on the 50th anniversary of the Edinburgh Writers Conference of 1962, which was in so many ways a very seminal literary conference, international conference, which provoked a lot of debate. The same themes are being revisited 50 years later by a range of different writers, some of them involved in some of the in different festivals along the way. Irvine Welsh here was present on the platform in Edinburgh last August, and the conversation will be resumed after those 4 remaining festivals after this one in Trinidad at the 2013 Edinburgh International Book Festival. Here in the Americas, the British Council, for which I work in this region, have been very proud to be partnering 2 festivals, one in North America, the International Festival of Authors in Toronto, where an event as part of this series took place last October, and now here in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, which, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was described by the great Cuban novelist Alejo Carpentier as the epicenter of the Americas, the center of the story of the Americas. And it's very appropriate, therefore, that one of the 2 international festivals as part of this series should take place here in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, hosted by this wonderful festival, who have supplied this tremendous program. I'm not sure that any other festival in the series has such a delightful program for the EWWC. Congratulations to Bocas for a fantastic festival. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you very much, David. He's taller than me. I've got to stand on tiptoe. Thank you, David. I will speak very shortly because this is being relayed live and we've on a very tight schedule. So what I really want to do is to welcome everybody and say thank you for coming. I'm lovely to see this room so full. Thank you to all the writers, because this is actually a writers' conference and the writers are meant to be part of it. I mean, these wonderful writers up here are going to be leading it, but you're part of the conversation and the rest of us are overhearing. And there'll be a bit of time too for some of us to jump in. I think that this is a great vote of confidence in Bocas to be included in the 14 countries where this conference is going on. I was at Edinburgh last August when it started. It was absolutely wonderful. But Anu Lakan, who's been working on producing this for us today, tells me that this is the one that everybody's going to be remembering, because you're going to get on so bad that we'll go down in history. But we're very good at behaving bad in Trinidad. So you have to live up to the cause, okay? So have fun. You will see me slipping out, but that's not because I'm in disagreement with anything you're going to say. Or if I am, I'm going to keep it to myself. So have fun. Thank you very much.
I'm the other Marina Warner, and my role is to chair this unruly batch of writers on the platform. I'm going to introduce, and then later we'll open up the themes, but you have a question before you, a national literature, question mark. And of course, from that, many, many questions arise. And indeed, even while trying to introduce our panel, I decided not to mention nationality, because it's already a complicated question of the relationship to the birthplace or to the writing style or mode. So Vanu Kapildeo is a poet, and her book, Utter, linguistic title of poems, is coming out from People Press later this year. Hannah Lowe is also a poet, and she is writing 2 books at present, one called Chan, and one a memoir, which is called Long Time No See, and that you're in progress. Irvin Welsh needs no introduction, but he tells me that he's about to go to LA to see if he can sell the new film, Filth. And Marlon James is our keynote speaker tonight. He has a new novel coming out, but not for a little while, so you'll all have to wait, which is called A Brief History of 7 Killings. So now over to Marlon, who will lead the discussion.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming out. I just, I'm going to get quickly to it. I just want to point out that the other Marlon James is here. So should I collapse at any minute, he'll take over with no change in the program. It's so funny. Back in another life, we used to work on photo shoots just to confuse people. So let's get straight into it. A national literature. As soon as I heard what was going to be the topic of this discussion, I thought of 2 things immediately. Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of the singular story, and an incident I experienced recently where, after being asked to interview the Jamaican poet Muta Baruka, I was, without my knowledge, then demoted to asking already prepared questions from the audience, all because a Jamaican organization found me unsuitable, an inappropriate voice to represent Jamaica to an international forum, which was sort of like telling Bunny Wailer that you cannot hang with Peter Tosh because you have been known to smoke weed. But what both instances reminded me of was the immediate pitfall of the danger in the term national literature. The same danger in terms like black music or women's fiction. That this is a categorization, and any attempt at categorization is reductive, like the Library of Congress reducing your novel to 3 words. Take away literature and substitute any other art, and this is quickly apparent. A national music, a national painting, a national dance step. Especially in this post-everything age, where national boundaries are not only irrelevant, but sometimes anti-art. Because at the core of categorization is an attempt to make something smaller and easily definable. Great art resists paraphrase, but is it national lit an act of paraphrasing? And we're already seeing this happening, a move, certainly in my country, Jamaica, to decide what is acceptable and unacceptable national literature. At the core of this acceptance versus rejection is a moralizing sprung from both religiosity and a certain jingoism, an attempt to enforce the singular story, sometimes with the delusion of diversity. So sure, let's have a gay story as long as it fits this acceptable arc of sadness, but what if it involves actual gay sex? And what if the people involved quite like it? Moralizing disguised as nationalizing rears its ugly head when we talk about violence. There's an acceptable limit, which can be crossed if there's an acceptable comeuppance. But what if you're an Irish playwright like Martin McDonagh and you're a master of violence? Well, that your poetry is gore, guts, and buckets of blood. And what if you're totally amoral about the whole thing? What if you're Jamaica's Jean Genet, or even closer, an actual Jamaican who navigates queer space to international acclaim and all but unknown in her home country, Patricia Dunker? Is Thomas Glave national lit? And what if you're none of these things? What if you're merely somebody in the Caribbean who wants to write about the middle class? You end up in a situation where your national lit isn't national enough. And what are teachers supposed to do with the national literature? Teach art or nationalism? I was part of the generation where this was first enforced, not just nationalism, but regionalism, clearly with good intentions. After all, if you spend your early years with Enid Blyton, you're going to need a lot of cultural correction. But the result was not a national literature or an appreciation of it. It was a steady diet of simplistic poems, leaden dramas, and failed novels that caused, certainly in my generation, an unhealthy association of local literature with mediocrity, with nostalgia, and with sentimentality. that these were works to be consumed because it was your national duty. These were works not because they had any inherent value. And another thing happens when you're in the midst of this. Another thing happens is that we're in the midst of your own literature, you disappear. Because there is nobody in these books like you. You unfortunately came from neither bush nor ghetto, so your voice is illegitimate. It certainly explains why in the discussion of Jamaican literature, for example, John Hearne and Louis Simpson rarely appear. What if you just don't look like a national writer? I remember when I was a student that I was told that nobody in Jamaica writes about the upper middle class but John Hearne, and nobody reads him anyway. And Lord knows the man should not be lionized, but he should not be ignored either. How do I get to be national enough? Who gets to define it? And will they be inclusive or restrictive? Because that really makes all the difference. A good parallel example for this is hip-hop. Between 1981 and 1991, rap music had its most creative years, certainly its most expansive, driven by this unbelievable sense of possibility. A form that came out of nothing could now encompass everything. But growth makes us nervous. By 1993, there was a growing mood that hip-hop was too expansive, too inclusive, and out of that came a new idea, that what is not hip-hop. The music started to define itself by drawing lines. You want to grow up? Sorry, not hip-hop. You're neither a bitch nor a hoe, you're not hip-hop. Can't keep it real and represent, you're not hip-hop. Now an art form had a gatekeeper. And not only that, it made gatekeeping the legitimate means for defining the culture. What's the price we pay for this? Of music, of literature becoming so easily defined because it's being protected. It becomes easily produced. It becomes easily parodied. So take one small rural village, 2 grannies, a church sister named Dorcas, 2 wayward children named Lurleen, and 1 Mass Joe, because there must always be a Mass Joe. Throw in some rivers, a mountain, and a brush with obia, and poof, you have a Jamaican novel. No movement has survived categorization. Not 70s style feminism that couldn't figure out what to do with non-American women. Or the Black Arts movement that couldn't figure out what to do with James Baldwin. A national literature, if it goes this way forward, as it sometimes threatens to do, won't get very far either. This is a problem that will stun art. Every few years, for example, we have a rash of Britain for the British fever, which is just a cutely racist way of saying British lit does not look British unless it's white. You get a case of too many paintings and not enough mirrors. Even rebellion gets couched in a nationally approved way, always moralistic, never complicated. Sexuality, if it happens, happens off stage. Poverty is always confused with simplicity. And the past is always suffused with nostalgia. A national literature whose first duty is to promote tourism, not art. Now, a national literature, if it's supposed to happen, has to be so broad that it risks vagueness. Like Japanese literature, it has to be constantly wrestled with and debated, even at the risk of extinguishing the very idea of it. Like Indian literature, it has to be both accept and throw away the concept of Indianness, and whether that has any bearing on literature at all. It has to include the next beloved, but it also has to include the next story of O. Criticism of it has to evolve beyond the petty sensibilities of critics and beyond the argument of whether a book should or should not have been published, or whether or not it hurts the brand. Japanese literature had to evolve from a very simplistic and jingoist idea of nationalism to something that celebrates both Murakamis, the one who dreams in fantasies and the one who writes sadomasochistic violence. Swedish literature is at once immediately recognizable and unclassifiable. It recognizes how essential it is, this contrary voice, this ambivalent voice, the deeply critical voice. Everybody, of course, knows The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. But some are unaware that its Swedish title is Men Who Hate Women. And it's a scathing critique of Scandinavian society's almost institutionalized brutalization of women. And yet the book is held up as something to celebrate in a way that a book called Men Who Killed Battymen would never be in Jamaica. At least not yet. Maybe we need to rethink the term, not just literature, but the term national. National literature should never be anything that follows the word should. There's no such word as should in art. It can be cultural despite no flag-waving purpose. When speaking truth to power is a greater service than describing beautiful beaches and wonderful people, it resists literary blackface. National literature is worth fighting for, but also worth fighting over. That it should never be confused with a national story. That's an advertising agency's job. A national literature wrestles with form, but also leaves it alone. A national literature reckons with how people actually speak. It recognizes fluidity and musicality of form and extends it. For a national literature to exist, it must also be uneasy with the term national literature, distrusting it every step of the way. Or a national literature is none of the above, but rather a blank space and a safe space, a sponsored space, but also a free space where nothing is beyond imagining, but anything can happen. Thank you.
Well, I think you can hear from the warmth of that we said, yeah, that something was recognized there. Yes, and this idea of, you brought up an idea of freedom from definitions and from self-image that is actually put up by some official sources or channels to insist on. So now, Vani, you have, I think, some general remarks to make about the actual idea of a national literature. I think she may be right because she's far behind. I mean, it's... Oh, there may be feedback because she's got a mic.
That was fascinating. Nobody can hear that, can they?
Sorry. You need the mic.
Thank you, that's a bit better. That was a fascinating talk by Marlon, and I was most struck by his grappling with the way that the word national drifts toward nationalistic. I'd like to go back to that word national and look at nation, the etymology, the word history of which is, of course, that which has been born. And I would like to question whether a national literature does have very much to do with birth, because if one takes seriously the Caribbean and, of course, Guyana, which is not an island, as a series of crossing places, historical crossing places over time, and takes seriously the fact that the University of the West Indies has 3 campuses in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, and takes seriously the fact that there has been mentoring of writers, marriage and affairs and letters and emails and plagiarism and fights across all the islands over decades, then possibly one might need to replace the word national with regional. Coming now to the word literature, and literature, of course, suggests 2 things to me. One is that which is written down for reading, and the other is an implication of something high versus low, you know, something you might have to answer multiple choice questions on and then not get into the school you want. So, as against the national or regional literature, I will invoke the idea of oral tradition, not just oral tradition in terms of storytelling or remembered and transmuted histories, but also the habit that people will have of narrativizing their experience within their heads. So even someone like Barbara Jenkins, Trinidad's prize-winning prose writer, who was first published in her late 60s, early 70s,
could arguably be said to have been writing all her life, but simply writing in her head, in her speech, in her communications with her students. So should one be looking for the site of literature in that which is published? I'm not sure. I don't want to take up much more than 5 minutes here, so I'm going to jump to the very controversial thing I have to say, which is not looking at ideas of elective affinities or the nation of the imagination, or myself as a diasporic person who is somehow Trinidadian, though I'm never in Trinidad long enough to see the turn of the seasons, nor have I planted a garden here. I'm not sure I would claim Trinidadianness for myself. I would like to ask, how is a literature national if it is not accessible to people within a geographical territory? Mervyn Morris calls for readers in his articles. He has been calling for readers for decades. Are there traveling libraries? Are there literacy programs where adults will read alongside children, not just storytell, but read? How are books published abroad disseminated? Are local authors and visiting authors willing to work for free and travel? How does infrastructure of transport affect this? Is national literature actually national flavor literature? So someone in New York, Paris, or with access to Amazon, someone in India with access to Flipkart, going to buy a Jamaican book or Trinidadian book, but that book does not percolate throughout Jamaica and Trinidad. So that is really the question I'd like to leave you with, is the relationship of national literature to the everyday narrativization, the practice of writing and reading and thinking oneself within and beyond the geographical and linguistic limits. Thank you.
Well, I think Vani's raised a very important issue, which is who reads the national literature. So not who writes it, but actually who reads it, and what happens to those readers who receive it, and how the contents are actually changed also in that relationship. So now to Hannah Lowe.
Yeah, I'm going to stay and sit here. Can everyone hear me? Fine? No? Am I heard? Great. Okay, I mean, it was great to hear Marlon expressing that anxiety about the single story in relation to the nation, but I guess I'm going to talk specifically about the dilemmas of English literature, since I've heard myself called an English writer here, so I guess I must be. Also because England is a key place in the Caribbean diaspora. I suppose in my thinking, it's a bit zigzag thinking, and I've talked to lots of people here this week, and so some of their thoughts have infiltrated my own, is the idea that if you're a country whose histories or stories have been suppressed or silenced or ignored, I can very much understand the kind of need, the desire, the urge to think about literature in a national way, and the stories, and I emphasise the plurality of stories that those nations might want to tell. But you know, I come from a nation that's been shouting and foghorning its own stories and histories for centuries at the expense of others, and I don't want to be a part of that. But of course, I wouldn't have been a part of that because I'm a woman from a working class background with a black father. So if a national literature can embrace the new subject positions that are now, the voices that we're now hearing from, and is about literature that maybe redefines Englishness, so I'm much more interested in that. But I still feel very anxious about national literature, the urge to define a national literature. I think it's particularly ambiguous with English literature, because English literature does not seem to mean literature of England, you know. And for years I was teaching in a sixth form college, A-level English literature. And the debate I always encouraged my students to have were the texts that we were studying, which came from Canada, India, Africa, Guyana, actually not better termed literatures in English. So there's this problem of definition around English literature. And also for that same reason, I instantly align the idea of an English national literature with the English literary canon and its history of very exclusionary practices. I mean, the mistake is mine, because the canon, of course, contains writers from Europe, America, and so on, Scotland and Ireland. But it still has these problems around definition. Moving on, I suppose the last point I'd like to say is that there is no homogenous national culture to be transmitted in England through literature, and I worry that any attempt to do so will limit the voices that are only really beginning to speak. And it really is a new thing. 20 years ago, we talked about ethnic minority writers, for example, being voices on the margin. And very slowly, perhaps those boundaries are shifting. I'm thinking, say, of a writer like Andrea Levy in Britain. But that's only just beginning to happen. And I worry that any definition of a national literature will be limiting in that way. Beyond that, and in my own writing, I'm interested in the place of regions. When I think about my own writing, it's Essex that is a linchpin, and London, and particularly it's Ilford, Essex, and Brixton, right? And don't laugh. And the Jamaica of my mind, and the Jamaica that I've written about, was formed in Ilford and in Brixton. It was formed through the multicultural Ilford that I grew up in the 1980s. It was formed within my household, the iconography of my household. And as an adult, it was formed by being witness and part of the Caribbean nation that existed in Brixton. So here really I'm talking about how the nation is not necessarily related to geographical space. Just spent 3 weeks in Jamaica researching this book, and now I'm worried that the real Jamaica is going to interfere with the Jamaica of my mind in a way. I think there's a big gap between being a writer and the national. Why am I an expert on anything national? I don't know. And as Marlon said, an artist, a sculptor, would not be called into that same position of responsibility if that's what a national literature might mean. In closing, I'm interested in why state-sponsored, institutions, state-sponsored activities, educational activities, international conferences want to talk about this. What is the need to define a national literature? I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for complicating the picture, I think. Very lucidly, though. Now, one of the things that Marlon said was that the national literature was not national enough. Now, I'm not sure that this is a criticism that could be levelled at you, Irvin.
Yeah, I think in general terms, there's not a lot I can disagree with what people have said, and it kind of, it's a bit of a mess, this whole issue, and as Marlon said, it's very limiting to think of a national literature, and we don't want to think of it because we don't really want to, when we start thinking about what constitutes a nationality, we get, that by its nature is very reductivist. But some of the things that have come up, which are kind of very interesting, it's, the first one is access, which has been mentioned. How can anything be said to be a national literature when people don't really have access to it? How can that be sort of the case that it's a national literature? So you've also got kind of issues like in some countries you've got suppression of literature. You've got either through overt censorship or more likely through kind of class and cultural grounds in terms of sort of publishing. Also in terms of the market, the way that the market's now structured, that people are encouraged to write into marketing holes, such as genre stuff. So there's a kind of, people are encouraged to write for a transnational market with a little bit of kind of nationalistic kind of flavouring thrown in. And ultimately the issue about it is all this is contested. Like any kind of culture, it takes place within a society with any kind of societies, they're always divided between kind of class, economics, culture, and literature. Any kind of literature that gets any kind of prominence is always contested in that arena. It's contested by government agencies, it's contested by kind of community agencies, it's contested by sort of community groups, it's contested by the writers themselves who try to keep some kind of hold of what their kind of vision of what they're trying to do is. So I think that literature, this is kind of moving away onto the sort of politics of literature and how it takes place within that kind of construct. But yeah, I mean, I think that that we have to remember that culture is always within the nation and out with the nation. Culture is always contested.
Did you say culture is always contested from the people who are making it, or are you trying to avoid the should word? Are you trying to? I mean, is it?
Well, I think it should be contested.
Yes,
it would be terrible if it wasn't.
yes.
You know, I mean, it would be very kind of scary and kind of moribund of society we lived in if it wasn't contested. So.
Yes. So one of the things I think that has come out is that the business of actually storytelling or making literature should occupy a space that is somehow defining itself against an official picture of some kind. And this can be done perhaps through language. That actually, when Derek Walcott says, "I have no territory now but the imagination," this idea of using language to make imaginary creations can be the place of contesting and of actually replacing the story that you're saying is the folkloric or the official picture that they want, and they want to censor you for not producing. And you, when you're talking about women's voices being submerged, I mean, would you like to comment a little bit on your relationship? It's very strong in Irvin's case, but your relationship to this idea that maybe nation is the homeland of the tongue. Now, I'm not going to say mother tongue because that's rather atavistic, but the idea of the actual place, the birthplace, is something you talked about musicality.
That nation is a...
Well, the nation is not the geographical or political unit, but in our scattered world of, I think that it's actually something to do with the linguistic construction of what you're making.
I think it can certainly be argued that way, but I also think it's something that will permanently be debated. Indian writers in the diaspora and Indian writers in the country will always fight, and actually think they should. And it's the same thing. The fact is, the majority of the Caribbean writers no longer live in the Caribbean, and that creates issues, including an unhealthy association with nostalgia. If you're going to write, for example, in dialect, how close is your ear to the ground if you're in Canada? So it does raise the questions of not even authenticity, because I actually don't care about authenticity at all, but just a sort of a dynamism that comes from being in constant contact with let's call it the mother country. It's just, part of it is just a fact of life that a lot of writers won't be here. I don't think not being in Colombia has hurt Marquez much. Or many of the Caribbean writers, quite frankly, because I think there's this idea that a lot of us, once we leave, that we're gone, when we're actually in our countries quite a bit. And we're still, you can't escape Jamaica. Nobody ever escapes it. You can't. Go 2 steps in Brooklyn and you run into it. So I think, yes, that nation, certainly from a literary perspective, is just too big. It's too broad. It can't be a geographical thing. But if you think you can escape geography in defining it, you're kidding yourself.
Dani, do you want to comment on that? Because your work is actually very experimental linguistically, and your last book is actually called Dark and Unaccustomed Words. And you try out many different forms of writing, many different registers of voice. And would you like to try and relate that to this idea of the nation as some kind of language that you carry with you?
Possibly. Oh, sorry. My first language seems to be howling.
Yes, howling, yes.
Yes. But I mean, dark and unaccustomed words is actually a phrase from George Putnam's 16th century work, The Art of Poesy. And I was reclaiming that phrase because he uses it in an exclusionary sense to critique fancy language. And I thought that, however, in a Caribbean context, that one person's dark and unaccustomed words, or words that are dark and unaccustomed in one context, become bright and clear in another. And so I'd like actually to quote Elizabeth Walcott Hackshaw, who, in her obituary for Aimé Césaire in the Caribbean Review of Books, said language more than geography separates us. And I mean, what I would really like to get at is that I don't see the Caribbean as truly Anglophone for two reasons. One, that there's always been a lot of reading of literature and translation, formal and informal translation, not just, for example, between French, Spanish, Dutch, English, and bits of Hindi or whatever, but also looking outwards when there was a great interest, for example, in Russian language literature earlier. But also at the level of the imaginary, that there are certain cultural forms, there are ways of saying, the volubility or proverbs or associations, different forms of logic, which even if someone is speaking English, arguably have got a Yoruba or Bhojpuri, Spanish or French sort of mashup in the background. So I don't really take English more as more than a surface manifestation. And I don't see my poetry as being experimental. I see it as being relatively naturalistic, a reflection of that kind of play.
Irvin, you're obviously very in the center of this, and I wondered the point that Marlon made about how being away from living in Chicago, you might not do the dialect of another country. How do you feel now you've moved to America about reproducing this extraordinary, energetic, demotic Scots that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you kind of, you're right. I mean, I don't believe in authenticity either as a writer. I think it's a nonsense. I mean, I think you write, you kind of write in your imaginative space, and you kind of draw influences from wherever you've been and wherever you are. And I don't think, in the same way that the nation can't kind of limit the way it sees itself, I don't think the writer can limit the way they see themselves. I think you kind of, you're constantly evolving and absorbing kind of different influences. And yes, I mean, in some ways it's like, if you have a certain, if you're associated with a certain type of writing, and you're moving around and you're doing different things, you're always going to be, you're always going to be accused, that this is somehow being diluted or it's somehow kind of being compromised and all that. But that's just a lot of shite, really. I mean, what the essence of it. The essence of it is that you write what you write, you always write what you write, and the proof of the pudding actually has to be in the writing itself. Does that stand up? Not in anybody else's imagination or preconceptions of it or of you.
Well, one of the things that a national literature might be expected to do is actually relate to history, and you mentioned this fact of the untold stories that could come through the lives of women, sometimes the lives of children, and how the imaginative literature can go to those places where the official archives may be silent. Have you found that with your new work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I'd like to pick up on the point that was just said about, Marlon made this point about, and then I could address that, about you can't lose Jamaica. But I think, what if you never had Jamaica, which I didn't, I wasn't born in Jamaica, but there is a strong link to Jamaica. These questions it's not just questions of authenticity with language, it's also questions of perception and the claim you make. Like, the Jamaican vernacular is one that is very familiar to me. I grew up with that all around me, my dad's voice. He switched between speaking very sort of with C pronunciation, so thick patois. And yet, for me to write in that voice, I feel is very problematic. And that's got also to do with the way I look. So I just like to further problematise these ideas around language. I never had the language, it was never my language. But I know the language, but I don't feel I can use it. So it's a slightly different thing. To kind of respond to your question, and again, apologies for sort of talking so personally and anecdotally. The history of my father's life in the Caribbean, which is one of growing up mixed race, part black and part Chinese, is lost. It's lost because he was silent about it. It's also lost because in Jamaica, the Chinese Jamaican experience isn't particularly well documented. And it's also lost in a broader, more global way in the fact that no one in Britain, for example, realises there are Chinese people in Jamaica. In Britain, Jamaica is black. You know, there aren't Syrians or Lebanese or Chinese. You know, so it's always a surprise. You say Chinese Jamaican, really? That's an unusual combination. Well, it's not an unusual combination, you know. And so for this, for me, it's been. I guess that's what I've been trying to find and define an archive to tell this story, and it's been. The personal story is gone, but I have been able to find out an awful lot through going to Jamaica. Yes. You know, through going to Jamaica and being there. So again, that tension between the Jamaica of my imagination and the real Jamaica is there, but it's going to Jamaica was good. Yeah.
Okay. We're now going to go to you. I'm going to take questions in clusters of 3. So if you could put up your hand so a mic can come to you quickly. And then we'll pass it to anyone who wants to pick up on the platform. Yes, Pankaj Mishra.
Thank you very much.
No.
Yeah. It's not on.
It's funny, this phone keeps ringing behind us.
Thank you. Thanks very much for fascinating, utterly stimulating set of reflections.
Can people hear?
Can you hear?
Oh,
okay,
better.
Great. I think I'm just wondering how and who really defines. I think more importantly, who defines national literature? And it seems from what has been said by the 4 panelists. First, there is the state. There is the state with its own peculiar aesthetic, where it sees literature as a means of nation building, and asks writer to contribute to that particular task. And it becomes particularly urgent when the nation has not yet come into being, and so many Asian African literatures really emerged out of the anti-colonial struggle. And national literature became a kind of aspiration. So I think, and the other way of defining it in recent years is the, do you want me to get? The other way of defining it is basically multinational publishing houses which identify particular national literatures and also choose which ones to privilege, which ones to publish or highlight at any one particular moment. Latin American fiction in the 60s and 70s is one instance of that, which means that a lot of literatures also emerging from those areas at the same time were neglected. There were certain kind of literatures that were privileged, magic realism being one of them, and more realist traditions were not highlighted. So that's another problem with defining national literature.
This is your problem.
I'm sort of wondering whether there is any way to retrieve this notion of national literature, because what the 4 speakers have done is really reduce the whole notion. Reduce it, actually destroyed it. And I'm wondering there is something to be retrieved, just in the way the nation state, however discredited it might be, there is something to be, something of value there.
Yes, between the Soviet model and the market model, there should be perhaps some middle way of actually creating.
Exactly, and as Hannah suggested, that there are certain suppressed voices that perhaps can only be articulated under the rubric of national literature. Then I have certain examples, but I won't hog the mic too much now.
Okay, so now Richard Drayton.
I want to actually follow on very naturally from Pankaj's question. I think it's very important, particularly in the Caribbean context, to note the extraordinary importance of political nationalism for the making of the Caribbean literary canon. And it is really in that interwar period of the emergence of a Caribbean national movement in separate territories, but also with a very strong federal consciousness. That you see the launching of Caic Overall in Guyana, of Forum in Jamaica, of BIM in Barbados. And if you look at that sort of formative generation of the 1950s and 60s, people like Martin Carter in Guyana or Derek Walcott, Till I Collect My Scattered Skeleton, Till I Collect, Walcott's attempt to make wine out of sea grapes. The process of the inventory of self and the kind of recovery of tone, of shade, of place, of character, of experience, this was absolutely critical to the possibility of this literature. And I suppose the questions which arise for me for the panel, because I think this was a fascinating session, these were four very, very, very important interventions, is really, first of all, whether you believe that some of your kinds of hesitations about the nation as a mode of consciousness has to do with some of the kind of crisis of the politics of the nation and of some of the anxieties of that. That's one point. And the second point would be that to what extent, to extend in a way the point which Irvin was making very gently, to what extent do you think that there's something, and which Pankaj was making more explicitly, there's something a little bit corrupting about many of the new opportunities which now exist for writers from the Caribbean or from India or from Africa or from Australia, which is the opportunities provided by big publishing houses and agents to make a decent living, which is a good thing. But there's a potential there for a kind of commercial exoticism where the writer ends up performing a particular kind of provincialism, but one which is sculpted and crafted for the international marketplace, and which has an inauthentic and sometimes dishonest relationship to the actual concrete experience, let alone the readership of the society.
Good. Who's that?
Thank you. My name is Rodney Foster.
Sorry?
My name is Rodney Foster. I was born here in 1946, migrated to the US, and I'm living there now for the past 40 years, but I come back and forth. I was looking for some clarification to define myself. I call myself a Trinidadian American, and I've written 2 books. Part of it is in the dialect of Trinidad, which I love, and I came here to get some help in defining who I am. And looking at the title, a national literature, I think we have to scratch out that word national, because in this age of globalization, we are not one or the other. We are several nationalities. And I'm just a writer now. A writer from Trinidad who has lived in Brooklyn, California, Atlanta, and I come back here, and there are some of my Trinidadians who say, we don't speak like this. And I thought we spoke a beautiful Trinidad dialect, which I'm trying to preserve. So I leave here this morning a bit confused.
Good, okay. Good, okay. So we now have, can we salvage the idea at all of a national literature? I mean, we've got, and also the problem of the market. I mean, this has come up in several people's comments today. Is there some way that the writer can be freed from these forces? You actually mentioned in one of your earlier speeches or talks that there might be funding, that maybe there could be some state-sponsored form of literature. But anyway, could you take Pankaj and the other?
No, I agree with Pankaj and Richard that without these nationalistic movements, this type of forum wouldn't even exist. That we're kidding ourselves that if Caribbean just sprouted somewhere and developed this identity, I mean, alongside, you know, a Martin Carter or even an Earl Lovelace, was a C.L.R. James, and even an Eric Williams, that I think even that sort of definition of self, which was certainly it was so crucial then and is crucial now, had to come out of a certain enlightened political sensibility. also, even in very, very practical ways, a lot of these writers got their first sort of real support from these politicians, from these people connected in these ways. And it's you know, it's ridiculous to ignore that. So that link is crucial. The idea, just the idea of Caribbeanness or Jamaicanness or Trinidadness came from that. But I can only speak for, I mean, the Jamaican situation is that can still run into a problem where you have to sort of, if you're going to be paternal, then you have to be a real parent, and at some point you kind of have to let the child go. And what the pressure is too often that you have a very, very narrow idea of what your child should look like. And that eventually becomes a problem, where with institutions with very good intentions becomes sort of the problem, sort of, yeah, what do you do with queer voices and somebody who wants to write science fiction or video games? That you have to be a kind of hands-off parent in a way, that you have to recognize that you really want this thing to go, you kind of have to let it go and stop having, and actually we forget that actually was the principle that was guiding a lot of these movements. You know, there was a time, for example, when Cuban literature was so expansive, but now Cuban literature is Nicolas Guillen, it's no longer Reynaldo Arenas. You know, because somewhere at some point somebody drew a line, and I think that's the thing that you have to be. This thing you have to be vigilant about as well. That there's that defining ourselves never become an act of line drawing. Yeah.
Vani, would you like to see a different way of publishing, writing from the diasporic world of the former kind of, you know, because a lot of this comes from the former colonial map. These publishing lists, and would you like to see that actually completely reconfigured?
Well, I was actually thinking of something quite heretical, which is in a way that map is. Well, first all, I don't think. No, first all, I'm not sure about the colonial paradigm, because someone like Jeremy Poynting, who obviously is based in Leeds, is all over the Caribbean all the time and genuinely transnational. So something like the People Tree List, even if it's being published out of Leeds, is essentially very, very Caribbean. So I'm not sure that those paradigms need to be as critiqued as they sometimes are. But the other thing is, I was thinking heretically that what's lurking behind some of the discussion is the idea that a certain mediatized global success is part of the package of being a writer. And why should one not be content with being locally known? Why is it that being read, because I'm a poet, I don't make money, I've lost money on all my books. And I give them away, people photocopy them, I encourage people to photocopy them, and so on. And why is it that having, say, 100 to 200 sales in London should be better than having 30 sales in Trinidad, 20 sales in India, 20 sales in South Africa, and 100 untraceable sales on the internet? I'm not absolutely convinced about that. And the other thing I want to talk about is embodiment and exhaustion. Because again, anecdotally, I know of two Caribbean origin people who were dealing with major publishing houses in the UK, and they were both turned back on their projects with the words, "We've already got someone from such and such," or "We've already done something from there." So unless stuff is happening within a geographical boundary, perhaps unfashionably corresponding with the nation, stuff is not going to happen. It's just a practical thing, really.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, an anecdotal thing. I mean, my novel was actually rejected by Penguin UK. And the editor, who I have a big respect for, asked me if I would consider rewriting it in standard English, because Britain and the rest of the world wouldn't get on board for a book in dialect.
Yes.
Then I said to her, of course, Huckleberry Finn is an American novel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think, Irvin, that in some ways the way that a novel opens up a window into, you know, takes us, the readers, to explore something we haven't experienced, that one could actually say that your vision of Leith has some characteristics of the exotic travelling that is kind of the effect of our reading Caribbean literature when it's packaged in. I mean, are we, when I go into your suburb, it's very, very unfamiliar to me, but so there's a sense of a comparison.
Yeah, I mean, nobody likes to think of themselves as a travel writer or kind of or sort of or promote. I mean, I think it's like that kind of question. I don't think it's a question kind of for a writer. I think it's it's a reader's question really, and how people respond to what they see. And obviously, if I read a book about a place that's unfamiliar to me, I'm getting a kind of vibe as a reader from that. So you're assuming that the reader is getting a sense of place from yourself too, but from your own books as well. But it's not something you're kind of overtly concerned with, I don't think.
Well, I think I was trying to shift this from picking up on Hannah's point about nation turning into region, because I think this is one of the things that has actually changed since the question was first put in Edinburgh 50 years ago. A national literature question mark. It's more now subtle to do with these diasporic communities that have been mentioned, by our comment there.
It's like one of the comments somebody made about the kind of nation state and the forming of a nation state. I mean, being kind of Scottish and kind of within a British context now, and what's happening with the referendum next year and the move towards kind of political independence or greater political independence, it's much easier for me to feel more comfortable about a kind of a literature within a kind of civic nationalism that Scotland aspires to, which is like a kind of a small sustainable nation state, kind of anti-imperialist without sort of a kind of big defence budgets and all that stuff, and it's kind of in a very kind of pompous place in the world, than it is to buy into a British literature. Yes, yes. Whether it will be the same, if and when Scotland becomes independent and it becomes an actual nation state, I would probably hate it then. I'll probably be kind of kicking against it, and I think that's exactly as it should be.
Yes. Yes. So now we need we'll go to, I think, here, maybe, here, okay. And I think you were early on, weren't you? Yes, and there. Okay. I can't.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Kaminga. There were a couple words. Oh, sorry. that really stuck in my head. Archiving stuck in my head. I guess I would hope that nations would spend more energy on national literacy than national literature, and that there's so many stories that are needed to be told. You spoke about Chinese-Jamaican, the whole Chinese-Jamaican story, but really it's how the story is written, and that I would hope that that it would be writers that would choose books that would be promoted as stories that are worth reading, but that it would be literacy that should be focused on, not national literature. And it's when you talk about national literature, that surely we're talking about government employees choosing what is worth being read, but that shouldn't be the case. It should be great writing that is worth being read. And you can write a story about, I don't know, a chair, and if it's well written, then it's worth reading. And so it's not completely clear in my head, but what is clear in my head is that it's literacy that should be focused on that, and not national literature.
Okay, thank you. Where are we? Who's the next person? There, yes.
I just wondered about criticism and the place of criticism, and whether a concept of nationalism is useful when it comes to teaching literature at university or schools. Because all the writing that the writing that you produce, sometimes you need a little bit of education to understand it, or where it comes from, the traditions behind it, and whether we could keep a little bit of nationalism for that, to do that job.
And then here.
I was struck when Marlon was speaking that he said it's worth fighting for and it's worth fighting over. And it seems we've heard a lot about the fighting over. And I just want to press that idea, I think, to return to what you were saying, is what's worth fighting for. And it seems to me that obviously during decolonisation, and I'm not saying that that's over, but at least during the kind of nationalist period, it was very clear why it was worth fighting for, that literature was a very strong rights-bearing vehicle. And I think that that's obviously not ended, and in many ways you're saying about queer writers is that ongoing project of wanting to question rights and the relationship between who gets to speak and whose rights, you know, the nation can bear. And also Vanna's question about rights around the literary as well, what's entitled to be called. And in this compressed time where national literature seems to say that you have to speak for, to, and be, you know, the only representative of, I just wondered if you think there's any way of recovering that discourse of rights.
Well, I think, Anne, as a teacher, I think maybe you could take the question, because there's a...
Yeah, I can
yes,
maybe
yes.
both of them. I think there's lots of things, actually. I mean, I think context is really important in teaching literature. I mean, I know there are all kinds of arguments about what you need to know to understand a text, but in my experience, for 12 years, teaching in an inner city college to students that came from a range of backgrounds, but mostly working class, many from sort of Asian, Bangladeshi, Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, context was really important in helping students understand Shakespeare, Chaucer, but also why should my students sitting in a classroom 3 years ago understand The Colour Purple by Alice Walker just because it's a text about black people any better than they should Chaucer, in fact. Two very different worlds, right? One of the things about suppressed voices, I noticed in the discussion about nationalism and the Caribbean literary canon, no women were mentioned, no women writers were mentioned. But in terms of suppressed voices, one of the things that in the UK is very much lacking from our teaching and curriculum is the teaching of creative literacy, by which I mean teaching young people how to write and encouraging them to tell their stories. I've been banging on about this every time I've had an opportunity to speak, that the essay as our currency of communication in academia should not be exclusively the only way in which students' intelligence and ability are measured. And to encourage students that have different backgrounds to speak, I think is so important. And one of the ways you do that is teach them how to tell stories. Teach them the craft of writing and the craft of poetry, you know?
I'm trying to remember the question now.
There was a question. There was a question about literacy there, and a question about
rights in the what sense?
The question of whether, if we almost say that we want to abolish the idea of the nation, and why would we want to fight for it, which you did say, fight for and fight over. Yeah. Is one of the reasons for fighting for it because it's at the level of the nation that rights are often still delivered and determined, and therefore that question about the relationship between literature and rights, you know, rights as a rights-bearing discourse, is still an ongoing one.
I think it goes to the heart of the question of various comments you all made, and that is there a responsibility for literature to elaborate an ethic that is based in the country you're in? I mean, and this, of course, is I mean, this is a big problem. Yeah. This is what's, in a sense, what you're saying. Do we find some way of? And I think you've all been saying you shouldn't actually, but let's just hear.
Well, as I said, that gets into the whole tricky territory of should. And I remember there was an interview with William Burroughs, and the author, the interviewer said, "So what should I write?" And he just stopped him. There's no such thing as should, with writers. But I think, the question of rights and should it be argued or fought for. I think that debate even about the very idea of what literature is should happen. It needs to constantly happen. It needs to be constantly fought down. It should be defended and argued against. It should be combative. One of my absolute favorite critics is Anis Shavani. And a lot of American writers really can't stand every time he puts something out because he has so much vitriol. Like, that's not vitriol. He's just arguing from the point of view, again, that books are worth fighting over. That the idea of two people having a very passionate discussion about a new book is a fantastic idea. that the real problem is when people aren't speaking at all. And when you get to a sort of very homogeneous, I can never pronounce that word, samey. The sort of samey idea of what literature is, that's when you end up with actually bad literature. That's why I can, you know, you don't have to try very hard. As I said, just bring in Master Joe and his donkey, you know, and up jump Mother Liza, and we have Jamaican lit. That it should be something that's constantly followed. It's one of the things I actually love about Japanese literature, that they are, granted they also had the post-war thing to deal with, but we have post-colonial thing to deal with, that there is always a constant fight over form and content. And what we need to realize is that is how it should be.
Well, I think that one of the things that Benedict Anderson said many, many years ago about the imagined community is that the imagined community can only be constituted if certain things are forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually the stories have to be sort of taken out. And I think one of the tasks that we're talking about and the writers actually take on is to uncover those. You mentioned Japan, but heavens, they had to revisit their past.
Yeah.
Germany, look at German literature. And in a sense, a lot of this Caribbean writing is about going back to the stories that were, the things that were forgotten, that on purpose were forgotten, to constitute the idea of the British Empire.
Yeah, but then there's the striking example of Nigerian literature, which in a lot of ways is just almost fast forwarding, which is one of the things that's really fascinating about it. That there's a reckoning with past, but it's some of the most contemporary fiction out there. Yeah.
We have lots of hands up, I know. Yes, there, Una, and at the back there. And here? Was it here? Yes. Okay. Good. So Una first, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is a really important discussion that there's no answer to really. And three quick things I'd just like to raise because of so many questions and answers. I think we still have not embraced and defined the Creole English language as a national language in many places in the Caribbean. And so how can we define national literature when we're not really recognizing our language that we use as a national language? We're still referring to it as dialect and vernacular. And I know there's a thin line, but that to me is a big issue because you can't really embrace it in writing fully because of it still having these sort of detachments attached to it. So that's one thing. The other thing, in this forum, many writers have been defining their work in a very nationalistic way and identifying themselves as nationals of particular islands. And doesn't this contribute to the idea of national literature? How do we separate ourselves from where we write from? And this brings me to, what does it mean to be a Caribbean writer? We sort of have a broad genre of Caribbean literature, but then what happens when a Caribbean writer writes about India? Or you cross those borders, you cross those boundaries. How do those geographic and identity issues be resolved in the definition of literatures?
So those are two questions actually to bear in mind: the Creole idea and the idea of the wider Caribbean. I think here, and then at the back.
Thank you. Irrespective of which country we speak about in the Caribbean, the legacy of slavery, colonial domination, which is still manifest in the political, economic institutions. Some writers, whether it's Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Chinua Achebe, they very affirmatively stated that their role as writers was to rehabilitate the sense of African consciousness, possibility. Should the Caribbean writer, since the legacy of oppression and suppression still exists, see, I think the expression was to liberate suppressed voices. Should Caribbean writers not see their role as being allied to the process of redefining and liberating the voices which have historically been suppressed?
Sorry, it's quite a quick question, I think, but I'm slightly reminded of when I think a group of biologists get together and you have a division between lumpers and splitters. Hannah used the phrase literatures in English, and I wonder whether you think it's more appropriate to say literatures, which is a kind of splitter phrase, or literature, which implies a seamless transition between different national. It also ties in slightly with the question we just had from Unia, which is if we're talking about a Creole language, are we talking about a Creole language, or are we talking about Creole languages in the sense that Belizean Creole and Guyanese Creole and Bahamian Creole are actually rather different?
Would someone want to take, maybe Vani, do you want to take one of those questions? How do you feel about, do you or not? Do you want to, which one? Well, do you want to take the one about the larger Caribbean, since from Una, about, I mean, after the Creole point she made, about the larger community of the region?
Could you just refresh my name?
Do you want to say it again? Yes, yes. So it's,
when we sort of go beyond those borders, what happens?
yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So your question was what happens when a Caribbean writer moves beyond the borders of the Caribbean, for example, a Caribbean writer writing about India. And I'm not entirely sure where to begin with that, actually, for two reasons. One is, I think, that a writer will find her or his affinities in so many and various ways that perhaps the legacy of any writer is the freedom for imaginative complexity. I think this is a conversation I've had with Kai Miller. I'm probably misquoting him, that we are building on the work of a previous generation who were fighting for rights. And now we are free to work with the non-reductive complexities of the imagination. And answering perhaps historically, I wouldn't, for example, find India totally foreign. I mean, I haven't yet been to Africa, but my encounters with African writers haven't been totally foreign feeling. I think having roots in the Caribbean is like having a set of keys. And having roots in the Caribbean, but also horribly having been colonized by Britain, you have a set of keys, some of them positive, some of them to do with oppression. And when you go abroad, you're encountering your brothers and sisters, really. You're not leaving yourself behind. So I think the Caribbean is actually a very privileged region in that we have more keys, perhaps, than others. And perhaps if we do have a rule, it is this messenger and metamorphic rule worldwide.
I wanted to come
Yes.
back to your question, because on one hand, I do think it's very important, but on the other hand, I still think it's kind of skirting into, again, should territory. And I think, the Chinua Achebe generation, is you're right, fought for a certain type of voice. But one of the things we have to realize is that a writer now no longer doing that is kind of a sign that Achebe won. That if Alan Mambunku can write a novel called African Psycho, which is just about an African who is trying so hard to kill as many women as possible, it's hilarious. That to an extent that he now feels free to then venture into any territory is a sign that Achebe won. It's a sign that his fight for liberating voices, was one. That Chimamanda Adichie is there, or even Atisha Cole is there, because that struggle, it still continues. But you have to. It's a sign that there were some major victories struck. And if Alan Mambunku is not writing African Psycho, it's in a way saying Achebe failed. So sometimes we have to recognize victory when it happens, that sometimes victory means we no longer write about the war.
But one of the things that comes up, I think, in your question is a collision between history. You're talking about the actual stories that happened, and the work of the imagination. because it's not necessary. Is there a responsibility for the imagination to record or retrieve history as it might have happened? I mean, this is a very, central question in an era of massively popular historical fiction. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Irvin, do you want to take that for?
Well, often, I think often we can overthink it really, because the writer writing is a very selfish, kind of self-indulgent act. Basically, you're kind of, you're looking at, you're operating from every kind of stimulus you've had of kind of culture, background, and everything you've read, seen and heard, every kind of encounter that you've had. And you're trying to sort of craft something from that hopefully has kind of universality, hopefully has appeal, and hopefully chimes with other people. I think if you start to get into the kind of, if you start second guessing either what should go in this in terms of a kind of, a sort of an overcooked and crafted sort of cultural sandwich that's going to appease certain people, or that is looking to have a market appeal, I think you've kind of really lost the whole point of being a writer. I mean, I think it's like the freedom of the blank page and the freedom of the imagination are your real tools, and that's kind of that's the starting point. Of course, there's all these other influences, but I think in many cases, one of the reasons I think writers don't like being on panels like this is because it makes a kind of subconscious process kind of more self-conscious, and you don't want to be self-conscious when you're a writer, because you don't really want to kind of kill the goose that lays the golden egg. You do want to get on with it. But yeah, I mean, kind of obviously tying it back to nationality, it's obviously one of the kind of the big areas, and the other ones like kind of class, race, gender, economic background and all, they're going to influence writers either more or less given their own particular experiences, and that's the way it should be.
Yes, Hannah, yes.
Just responding to this idea that Marina just mentioned, that there might be a responsibility to imaginatively reconstruct, and I emphasise the word reconstruct, a history of oppression, for example, in the Caribbean. It's impossible to accurately do that. You can only reconceive or reconstruct, and how writers do that is of great interest. It's almost of more interest to me that the gaps and the silences become the theme. It's the reason there are gaps and silences that is interesting, and those are things that can be exploited in the work. When a writer deliberately makes clear to a reader that there is an act of reconstruction going on, that in itself is political. It forces the reader to think about why. Why isn't there? Where is why can't we be accurate here? Is the question.
I think we have one question there and one more on this side over there, and then those are the last questions, I'm afraid. Yes. Hmm? Sorry? I've been told to stop, so it's...
Sorry. I wanted to come in earlier and the conversation has moved on, but I was left holding the mic, so I'm going to take my chance. My name is Peter O'Connor. I write a newspaper column. I want to join those who earlier expressed a concern about trying to define a national or regional literature. Out of that, I see committees who might decide whether this work or that work might apply or comply, and I think we should leave it alone and let it grow like a saman tree and let it spread, and eventually out of that we will have a regional literature that has defined itself and grown on its own. I worry about control.
Yes,
thank you.
Good. Okay. And one more there. This is the last one.
My name is Melanie Abrahams. I'm a literature producer and curator, and what's kind of scrawled over my notebook and been a kind of preoccupation throughout this talk are the words "towards independence." I'd really like to explore independence, given that last year it was 50 years of independence for Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. And for me, I guess there's the sense of someone working as an independent producer, in order to be able to, I feel, be productive, I have to keep reminding myself that I am independent, and I have to go with the intention of being independent. Otherwise, I can get sucked in to aspects, I guess, of what I would call nation building or other definitions. And I would think that for anyone who's working creatively, that might be the case. I guess at the same time, as someone who is always aiming to think independently and think imaginatively, I would be foolish and ungrateful to not also be collaborative and look at the kind of wider ecology in which I exist and the fact that there are many organizations and institutions that help me. So I guess the question to you, and I feel bad asking you that question because I don't think this is necessarily a question for the writers because you've been so remarkable in your own kind of espousing of what you believe. But I suppose my question is, in the age of independence, how can all of those working in literature encourage independence thinking and imagination that should be existing?
Well,
I
think we can take that as a comment, actually.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's, unless someone who's burning to say something.
Well, no, I was just going to respond to the first question. I think that so it is important that literature sort of has this space to grow and independent of this sort of government control and this sort of forced definition of what Caribbean literature is. And writers need space, but writers also need money. And writers need funding, and writers need grants. I think governments should just get a little bit more sophisticated about what exactly is the literature they're promoting, and that it's not a situation where it has the requisite number of beautiful beaches and wonderful people. That you have to sort of get kind of mature about it. That you're supporting art, you're not supporting a sort of jingoism. And they have to get, actually, maybe they should read a little bit more. Because the fact is, we're in the Caribbean, we need the money. And the support and the infrastructures, and they have to get to the point where they are sophisticated enough to respond to that. And play a more constructive role and play a role of I'd rather just close your eyes and give me the damn money. and leave artists to make art.
This leads in very well to the next debate, which will be tomorrow at the same time. Should literature be political? Because I think many of the things that have been said today actually lead into that debate. Yeah. Because it's the politics of the market we've heard a great deal about, the access of readers, and on the whole, I think it will be fair to say that you have asserted your freedom as writers not to serve a national literature. I think you've said that.
Unless we choose to. I said unless we choose to.
So please would you thank the four.